Welcome back. This is Mach Plugin Wizard XYZ Tutorial Section 3B. As I said before, I'm limited on time, so let's get right to it. We'll start up our compiler. We'll load up our tutor program plugin. We'll load up the Solution Explorer, and we'll load plugin CPP. Now, again, up here at the top are a bunch of comments. You should maybe read them. I'm going to try to go through this fairly fast so I can fit in the time, so excuse me if I gloss over some things. Some of the details will be covered in subsequent sections having to do with Manage Global and XML.NET, and so and how to do demo dialogues and things like that. So please bear with me and we'll get through this. Up here at the top are our standard include of standard AFX. Then we need our include. Then we need Mach's include so we can get to the external variables that are the pointers. Since I'm using 3 dialogues, I need the includes for those. So here's the config, the plugin, and the XYZ demo dialog, which is the one that is our modeless box that we're using to display as a simple explanation. Now, since this is going to use the XML file, I had to include an XML.NET profile. We'll run over that real quick, like I say, as we use it. And then this trick about Manage Global that I introduced you to a little bit in the overview, and that there will be a separate tutorial for that item. So for these 2 items, I'll have to gloss over them quickly as they're used, but then there will be a separate tutorial. Again, I always include standard lib so that I can have it in case I need it. That's where things like string dupe and things like that come from. The namespace is a using namespace definition that we have to say what namespaces we're going to use, and we're going to use the XYZ tutor namespace. The menu start is instantiated here in the plugin. It's made an external in the H. It's an int. It contains that magic number that they return you. Now, here's our first optional plugin extension. Called init control. Now, init control in this implementation, all we do is call get menu range, which is the pointer that has been provided to us by Mach, to call into Mach and ask for how many menu items we do. And that's all we need to do in our init control is get the menu range. Now, let's go over it real quick. We'll do it on this one, and then we will be ignoring these in the future. The if-def that is wrapping the entire thing is whether or not you have defined that you want an init control. Then inside of that is an if-def having to do with whether you're running in the mixed mode or manage environment, which we are since this is a CLL project. And then there is the pragma being implemented if we are inside of managed, if we are defined, to say that this should be done as managed code. And then there's the matching indiff for the managed and the matching indiff for the init control. So please, I'll gloss over them and the rest. They all will look like these at the beginning and end of each function. Okay, now for probably one of the first that have some meat in it. The set profile name. It's an extension of the set profile name. It's called, I have defined it, I'm going to use it. We let you know that it will be called, that when you call this, you can access XML, and that it will be called even if the plugin is disabled. So you need to give some thought of whether or not you want to create a whole bunch of dialog boxes and things like that. I recommend against it. I recommend that you only go out and access the XML if you want to, and then initialize your configuration block or structure and store that structure in the Manage Global. I'll try to describe that as much as I can, but we'll have to maybe cover it more in the Manage Global area. I have defined in the Manage Global header a reference structure called XYZ demo config. I'm going to create or instantiate a pointer. The caret here is a new syntax that is used in C++ mixed, that it's a pointer to a managed memory item compared with a regular heap item. So you just have to use these type of pointers for everything you do in .NET. So I'm going to create a managed pointer, which will be the lowercase version of the same thing, called XYZ demo config. This will be a local variable that will just exist within this function. And I'm going to gc new an XYZ demo config, which is a structure that I will make one on the heap, on the managed heap, and get its pointer. Now, I'm also going to make a profile, which is a pointer to an XMLNet profile class, and I'm going to gc new it, and I'm going to, it's going to be an XMLNet profile class that I'm gc newing, and it has 3 parameters. The 3 parameters are the profile name or path, the section name that I want to use by default, and I'll show you how you can modify that if you need multiple sections, and a true to say that I want to allow the tree structure option of XML. Again, I'll have to cover that more in the XML, just trust me, it's a nice new feature. So we pass it in the profile name. Now, it will not accept a char pointer. If you try to give it, your compiler will give you an error. So we have to take the char pointer and create a string object, and then by doing that we do a gc new string and then pass that. This is just the syntactical glue to get from unmanaged code to managed code. Then we give it our section name, and then we give it a true. Okay. Now, the way I wrote the XMLNet profile is it doesn't load it until you tell it to load it. It just creates the object, an empty object. So you have to say, use the pointer that we just created and call the function called load. Now, you'll notice that load returns a bool, and in other parts of my code I'll use the bool to safety myself, but in this case I didn't care whether it was successful or not. I mean, I care, but either way, if it was unsuccessful, I'll have an empty and all of the defaults will come in. If I was successful, I'll have the existing one, and either the defaults will come into play or the actual XML file will be parsed. Now, I'm going to look on the right-hand side of these equals for a second. I'm going to use my profile pointer. I'm going to point to its function called readBool, and readBool has 2 different calling capabilities. It can either be called with just a string, and it will return with a default, or it can be called with a default value. For simplicity, we just always pretty well give it a default value. The default is false, so I could have actually left it off in this case. Now, we give it the string that is the variable within our XML that we want. And in this case, and I'm going to run down these 4 right-hand sides of the equation, we're going to pass it DLG axis/x, axis/y, and axis/z. Now, for the DLG, we're going to default to false, and for the others, we're going to default to true. Now, these will return a bool. Now, I've enhanced the profile so it has bools, doubles, ints, and strings, just because I like to use bools for things. So it will read in a bool and return a bool. Now, we're going to take that bool and we're going to save it in our structure that we got a pointer to that will contain our configuration. And this structure contains just 4 items: enable dialog, enable X, enable Y. So we're going to take the bools out of the XML or the defaults and store them in our structure. Now, here's the magic glue having to do with managed global. This variable is only instantiated during our function, and when we exit it would disappear, but we want to remember our configuration. So we take the pointer and store a copy of the pointer in a static variable in our MG Manage Global class. This will allow us to get it later on in another function. Just trust me, and we'll cover this more under Manage Global. Now, we then return the name of our plugin, which has been inserted here by the wizard, and the author and the version. And here's where we'll take a minute and we'll edit this and say, Ed Bryson wrote this. Now, you can have a space in here, and for some reason, I think he did it for parsing purposes, Art and Brian will add a dash in there, but you could either put your dash in there or not. I usually do it without the dash and let them add it for me. So that's all set profile name does. It optionally, and in this plugin I chose, it can open up the XML file and it can work with it, and then I use the items in it to store them in a config block, and then I put those config blocks in my manage global space so I could get my hands on them later on when I need it. And then its final job, very important job, is it is to return a single string. You can't do pluses and concatenates in this return because it needs just a pointer to an entire string block. If you have to do it that way, you'll have to actually build a string and concatenate it and do all those things and then call a function that would return you an LPCSTR. So that's what set profile name does. Now, post init control, the XML file cannot be accessed, and it is only called if the plugin is enabled. Now, the big use that it gets used for is to add our plugin menu to the Mach menu. Now, I have implemented this code for you. You shouldn't have to modify it. If you click include profile plugin control on the wizard, it will include this code for you. This is all Win32 code, so you can use this with MFC or .NET or in a Win32 environment only. And so I took the trouble to implement, and I use the get menu function, and I use our Mach view pointer, and it points to the Mach frame element, and then in Mach frame there is a member handle to a wind. I then do some other stuff in here. We could cover this more in a future tutorial if you really need to understand it. You can also get some books on Win32 if they're still in print and figure out how it works. But the important thing is it runs through all of the menus that are across the top of Mach, and it gets a menu item, and it actually has to get it twice, once to find out how long the string is and then once to get the actual string, and it compares that string to the words, the literal plugin control. Now, this is the safest way to find a header. Now, a note, if in the future they change this header, you'll have to change this code, and if they add a underscore, one of the fast keys, to being the P or something like that, the text will actually change. It will contain the ampersand, as it's called. When it finally successfully finds the plugin menu, if it finds one, which it should, it will save that in the variable, which is a handle to a menu, and then you come down here, and if it was found, you should insert your menu item. Again, these are all Win32 calls. You should see stuff like this in just about every other plugin, although they will, in most of them, use an MFC function called find menu item, which takes care of that fancy stuff up above, but then it's less portable. Okay, so that took care of that. So I always think of post init control, I think that's where we're in. Yeah, post init control as having two purposes. I need to get myself on my menu, and I need to instantiate or create a bunch of dialogues or whatever that I might need to persist across the entire function, the entire plugin. Now, again, we're going to use this syntactical magic that is a caret to create a pointer of an XYZ demo dialog, which is a class which was created by our dialog editor, and we're going to make a pointer to it, which is going to be a lowercase version of the same name, and we're going to GC new it a copy of the dialog. Now, we're going to immediately start modifying that dialog by taking its pointer, pointing to its member, label X, and pointing to its visible property. And we're going to take out of our manage global area our demo config and get its enable X, which is a bool. So this bool will be put into this bool, and it will make this label visible or invisible. We do the same for all three labels using the enable X, Y, and Z, and then we do the same for all three text boxes using the enable X, Y, and Z. Then we finally set the overall visibility for the entire dialog with the enable dialog. Now we use that magic of saving our dialog pointer, which is only a local variable, in our manage global so that it will be there when we need it in our other functions. Okay. PI config. PI config, it creates a local variable of a dialog, a pointer to that dialog, a GCNUD pointer, a manage pointer, a GCNU of config dialog, and then it does what's called show dialog. Now, show dialog is actually a function that is usually used for a modal dialog. And normally you would want to know whether the user clicked OK. We don't care. We're just putting up a box that doesn't have any buttons. We're just putting up a box that says configs don't live here anymore. So in this case, we just call the show dialog and wait for it to return. If you're going to do your configuration in here, of course you're going to have to do more work. But most people are now choosing to do their configs in the PyNotify, or in a class or function that is called by PyNotify. So that's it for config. Now we'll go down to stop plug. Now again, I'm doing these in the order they get called. Now PyNotify is called when somebody clicks on something, so it doesn't belong in a sequential list. That's why it's down near the bottom. PyStopPlug is an extension of the stop plug. In this case, all I'm going to do is save my XML, and we'll run through this again real quick. We first have to create a pointer that is a local version of the pointer that is saved in the global. Now the reason we have to do that is we are going to want to modify that variable or the contents of that variable, and one of the things that happens in manage global is it gets declared as a static, and the compiler rules are that if the pointer is a static, everything inside of it is read-only. So by copying the static pointer into our local pointer, our local variable pointer, we get read-write access to that structure. Now, the other thing we of course do is we create a new net profile. So we don't keep these lying around. We only make them when we need them and throw them away when we're done. By the way, you'll notice no disposes, no frees. A managed item will get garbage collected automatically. So you just create it as a local variable, and when this brace ends, when the function ends, it will be marked for deletion if it has not been copied to another place. That's the trick with Manage Global. So we instantiate a new profile, and we pass it the profile name just like we did before, and we pass it our section, and we pass it our true because we're using the tree structure. Now we call profile load. In this case, we care whether it loads. We care because there's no reason to do a save if we can't do a load. Now, that would not be true if you're doing your own XML. But since we're doing the Mach 3 XML, in this case actually Mach 3 mil.xml in my demos, we will only want to save it if we successfully loaded it. So that's why this is inside of an if. And if we loaded it, then the first thing we want to do is modify our configuration to save the current visibility of the modeless box. If the user has closed that box, then when they start Mach up again, we will come up with that box closed. If they've left it open, the next time we start Mach, we will open it. So we're trying to remember the state. Now, in this case, we can take it straight out of the manage global because we're only examining or reading that variable. So we take the visible from the demo dialog in our Mach global and we save it in the enable dialog of our configuration structure or block. Now, we then call for write bools to save the current state. Now, this line up here was the only line that we had to do the trick about making it not be static anymore. We could have just written them to the file, but since I wanted to modify it, I had to do that. The XY demo config is our config block, and it contains enable, 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 dialog X and Y, and we save those as a write bool into our profile of the DLG, the axis /X, the axis /Y, and the axis /Z. Now, in the tutorial for XML.NET Profile, I will actually bring up the profile, the XML. You can, of course, do that on your own machine, but you'll see how these slashes work. And just a note, you can have multiple layers here. You could have axis /X /color, and you could store the color that you wanted it to be, or whatever. So you can have multiple layers. And if we've successfully loaded, we've saved our bools, and then we have to save our profile. I made it that you had to tell me you wanted to save it. And then we're done. That's the end of stop plug. Now let's continue on. PI update is the update loop. It's called every tenth of a second. Now, warning, when you enable the plugin, it immediately gets added to the update loop. So if you've got some variables that you haven't created or initialized, then you've got to protect yourself from that, and you'll see some ifs inside of here. I mean, one if inside of here. All we're going to do in our update loop is if there is a demo dialog. If this has been started as a plugin that has previously been enabled, we will have called our post init control, and it will have created this dialog. It may not be visible or not, but it will have been created. So the system stores what's called a null pointer in anything that hasn't been initialized. Therefore, we can just say if this is not null, if this is non-zero, we know that one exists. So I didn't have this if in here and found out about the update loop getting initialized. So the first thing we do, because we're going to want to modify the text within the dialog, is we have to instantiate a new pointer that is a local copy of the global pointer. So again, just trust me, and I'll go over this in Manage Global in more detail. We create a pointer to our demo dialog class, and we take the copy out of the Manage Global and copy it into our local. Now that it's in our local, it is read-writable, and we can take the dialog, point to the text box, point to its text. This is the beauty, in my opinion, of .NET. You don't have to call functions and do updates and things like that. You can directly manipulate, if they are public, functions and controls within your dialogues. And it just makes it so much easier to get the data in and out of dialogues. Now, we're going to call the function getDrow, which will return a double and expects a number, and we just know the magic number of 800, 801, and 802. We could also use some defines here, and it's going to return a double. Now, the nice thing about .NET is that along with all your other functions, you get a toString for practically everything. And double includes a toString that if you pass it an F4, it will return a fixed 4-digit decimal point string. So since our text box needs a string, we have to convert our double to a string, and we just do it with the toString option. So we're going to do that for these three items. Okay, hopefully we got time. Now on to our notify. Notify will be called for a lot of other functions, but more importantly in this demo, it will be called with the ID of our menu. I only have one menu item, so if the ID is equal to menu start, they have clicked on our menu item. Now, We'll cover this more in the plugin dialog, but let's just try to run through it real quick. We will instantiate a new plugin control dialog. Now in this case, there's not a version of it in Manage Global. This is only going to get used during this function. So it's just a local variable. We will instantiate, though, one of our demo config pointers and get a copy of it out of the Manage Global, because we need to be able to write to it, and we can't live with read only. We will modify our configuration to contain the current status of whether or not this dialog is visible. Then we will modify the checked property of the 4 checkboxes on our dialog, and we will set them to what is the current configuration of the 4 checkboxes. Then we will call show dialog. Now in this case we'll call show dialog and look at its result and find out whether they clicked OK. If they clicked OK, we will go out and get the 4 checked bools. See, that's one of the nice things. They're already bools. And we will save them in our configuration. Now, we also want to immediately make the modeless dialog react to our new configuration. So we need to get a copy of our demo dialog pointer and set the visible states. Now, in some good clean coding, I probably should have made this a subroutine, because you'll notice this is the same code that we used back before, but I wanted to leave it linear so you could see the code in this example. So these same 8 lines of code we've kind of gone over before. Now, again, this variable will be discarded when this block is done, but it will still live on in the Manage Global. We are just working with a working copy of the variable. Okay, the rest of the functions are not used in this one, so they're all kind of grayed out. So we'll scroll to the end, and that's the end of plugin CPP. Sorry for the speed of talking and the brevity, but I'm trying to live within a time restraint, and hopefully I've succeeded. See you in the next tutorial, which will probably be the Manage Global and then followed by the XML net. So thank you very much. Bye.